2 bombs, 1 soul that wouldn't break. Complete narration script. TheWarTales introduction. Imagine waking up on an ordinary morning, heading to work, and suddenly the sky transforms into fire. You survive the impossible. 3 days later, history repeats itself. At the exact moment you're telling your colleagues what you experienced, another atomic bomb explodes. This is the true story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the only man officially recognized for surviving both nuclear attacks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A journey steeped in unimaginable pain and trauma, but also in extraordinary human resilience. What would you do if the apocalypse chased you twice? This is a story about survival, but more importantly, about the choices we make when faced with the unthinkable. Chapter 1. The Engineer from Nagasaki. In the spring of 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was a 29-year-old man living what many would call an ordinary life. Born in Nagasaki on March 16, 1916, he had worked his way amidst, become a respected naval engineer at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, one of Japan's most prestigious companies. His days were filled with technical drawings, calculations, and the meticulous work of designing oil tankers that would serve the Japanese Empire. But Tsutomu's life was far from just blueprints and steel. He had built something more precious than any ship, a family. His wife Hisako was a gentlewoman who managed their modest home with grace, despite the hardships of wartime Japan. Together they had 2 young children who filled their small wooden house with laughter, a rare sound in those final months of World War II. Nagasaki in 1945 was a city living under the shadow of war. The port city, nestled among hills and blessed with a deep harbor, had been a center of international trade for centuries. Its streets were narrow and winding. Climbing up steep hillsides where traditional Japanese homes with curved tile roofs stood shoulder to shoulder. The Mitsubishi shipyards dominated the waterfront, their massive cranes silhouetted against the sky like mechanical giants. The air always carried the smell of salt water mixed with industrial smoke. By early summer, the war was clearly turning against Japan. American B-29 bombers had been devastating Japanese cities with incendiary raids. Food was scarce. Every family had lost someone, a father, a son, a brother, yet people continued with their daily routines because what else could they do? Tsutomu walked to work each morning, kissed his children goodbye, and tried to ignore the growing anxiety that gripped his nation. In June 1945, Tsutomu received orders that would change his life forever. The Mitsubishi Corporation needed him in Hiroshima for a 3-month assignment. His expertise was required to finalize designs for a new class of oil tankers. It was just business, just another assignment. He had no way of knowing he was walking toward a date with history. Hiroshima, located on Japan's main island of Honshu, was different from Nagasaki. Flatter, more spread out, built on a delta where 7 rivers branched through the city before flowing into the inland sea. It was home to nearly 350,000 people and served as an important military hub. Unlike other major Japanese cities, Hiroshima had been largely spared from American bombing raids, though no one understood why. Some whispered that the Americans had family connections there. Others thought the city was being saved for some strategic purpose. The truth was far more sinister than anyone imagined. Tsutomu spent his days in Hiroshima working in the Mitsubishi design offices, his nights in a company dormitory. He missed his family terribly. In his letters home to Hisako, he described the city's beauty, the way morning mist rose from the rivers, how the ancient Hiroshima castle stood proud despite the war, the bustling streetcars that still ran on schedule. He told her about his colleagues, 2 other Mitsubishi employees who had also been sent from Nagasaki. They became his companions in this temporary exile, sharing meals and stories about home. As July turned to August, Tsutomu counted the days until his return. His assignment was nearly complete. The technical drawings were finished, the calculations verified. Just a few more days and he would be back in Nagasaki, back with Hisako and the children. He had already purchased small gifts for them, a wooden toy, a silk handkerchief, tokens of a father's love during impossible times. On the evening of August 5th, 1945, Tsutomu and his 2 colleagues finalized their departure plans. They would leave Hiroshima the next day. The train tickets were purchased, their bags were packed. That night, Tsutomu lay in his dormitory bed, thinking of home, completely unaware that he had less than 12 hours before his world would end. The first lesson of Tsutomu's story begins here. In these quiet moments before catastrophe, we never know which ordinary day will become the most important day of our lives. We make plans, we count on tomorrow. We assume the world will continue as it always has. But life has a way of shattering our assumptions without warning. The question is not whether tragedy will find us, but how we will respond when it does. Chapter 2, August 6th, 1945, The First Inferno. August 6th, 1945 dawned clear and hot over Hiroshima. The sky was that particular shade of blue that promises a scorching summer day. Tsutomu Yamaguchi woke early, as he always did, energized by the thought that this was his last day in Hiroshima. By tomorrow evening, he would be home. He dressed carefully in his white shirt and dark trousers, the uniform of a salaried man. There were final documents to review at the office, last-minute checks to complete. Professional to the end, Tsutomu would not leave a job half-finished, even in his eagerness to return home. He met his two colleagues for a simple breakfast, watery miso soup, and a small portion of rice, the meager rations that had become normal in wartime Japan. At 7:30 in the morning, they left the Mitsubishi offices to retrieve some forgotten documents. The streets of Hiroshima were already awake. Women in simple cotton kimonos swept their doorsteps. Children played in alleyways before school. Office workers hurried to their posts. Streetcars clanged along their tracks. It was a Monday morning like any other, filled with the small rituals that make up human life. Tsutomu and his colleagues walked along a wide street near the Otter River. The morning sun was warm on their faces. They discussed their journey home, debating whether to catch an earlier train. They laughed about something trivial, something none of them would remember later. The city hummed with life around them. Approximately 350,000 souls going about their business, completely unaware that they had minutes left to live in the world they knew. At 8:15 a.m., everything changed. First came the flash, a light, brighter than 1,000 suns, a brilliance that seemed to split the sky itself. Tsutomu barely had time to register it before his engineer's mind noted something impossible, a colored ring expanding rapidly across the heavens. His body reacted before his mind could process what was happening. He dove to the ground, covering his head with his arms. Then came the heat, a wall of thermal radiation moving at the speed of light, carrying temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius. Tsutomu felt his exposed skin igniting. The left side of his face and his left arm, which had been facing the blast, were instantly seared with third-degree burns. His white shirt provided some protection, but the heat penetrated everything. The pain was beyond description, beyond anything he had ever imagined pain could be. The pressure wave followed seconds later. The air itself became a weapon, a physical force that picked up Tsutomu's body and threw him like a rag doll. He felt himself flying, tumbling, unable to tell up from down. When he finally stopped moving, buried under debris, his ears were ringing so loudly, he thought his head would explode. Blood ran from his nose. His left eardrum had ruptured. For several minutes, Tsutomu lay there, unable to move, unable to think. The pain from his burns was so intense that his nervous system seemed to shut down, unable to process such overwhelming sensory input. Slowly, survival instinct kicked in. He began to push away the wooden beams and debris that had buried him. His hands, though burned, still functioned. Inch by inch, he dug himself out. When he finally stood and opened his eyes, Tsutomu Yamaguchi saw hell on earth. Hiroshima had ceased to exist. Where moments before there had been a thriving city, there was now only a vast flatland of destruction stretching in every direction. Buildings had been vaporized. Those farther from the epicenter were now skeletal remains, their walls blown away, their wooden frames burning. The rivers that had given Hiroshima its beauty were now filled with bodies and debris. But the buildings were not the worst of it. It was the people. Thousands upon thousands of people all around him, in various states of death and dying. Some had been carbonized instantly, their bodies frozen in their final moments, reduced to black shadows burned onto stone. Others were walking, if you could call it walking, their skin hanging from their bodies in strips, their clothes burned away, their faces melted, beyond recognition. They moved like ghosts, arms outstretched, moaning for water, for mercy, for death. Tsutomu stood in the center of this apocalypse, his own body screaming in agony, and called out for his colleagues. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the roar of countless fires. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning flesh, a stench that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The heat from the fires was suffocating. Ash fell from the sky like black snow. Somehow, incredibly, he found them. Both of his colleagues had survived the initial blast. They were burned, bleeding, in shock, but alive. The three men from Nagasaki stood together amid the ruins, trying to comprehend what had happened. Around them, Hiroshima burned. The wounded cried out in voices that no longer sounded human. The sky had turned dark, blotted out by smoke and what would later be called black rain. Radioactive fallout mixed with ash and debris. What do you do when the world ends around you? How do you process the annihilation of everything familiar, everything safe? Tsutomu's engineering mind, trained to solve problems logically, struggled to accept what his eyes were showing him. A single bomb. One bomb had done this. It was impossible, yet here he stood in the proof. The three men made a decision. They had to survive. They had to get home. Families were waiting. Through the pain, through the shock, through the horror that surrounded them, they clung to this single purpose. Get to the train station, get to Nagasaki, get home. Their journey across the destroyed city took hours. They picked their way through debris, around craters, over bodies. The injured begged them for help, for water. But what could they do? They were barely surviving themselves. This is one of the cruelties of catastrophe. Survival often requires ignoring those who are dying, choosing yourself over others, living with that guilt forever. The train station, miraculously, was still, partially functional. Trains were running, though on what schedule, no one knew anymore. People were desperate to leave, to escape this place of death. Tsutomu and his colleagues waited, their burns untreated, their bodies going into shock. When a train finally came, heading toward Nagasaki, they pushed their way aboard with the last of their strength. As the train pulled away from Hiroshima, Tsutomu looked back at the city that was no longer a city. A massive column of smoke rose into the sky, mushrooming at the top in a shape that would become iconic. He did not know it yet, but he was looking at the signature of nuclear warfare, the mark of humanity's most terrible invention. The journey to Nagasaki was a blur of pain and fever. Tsutomu's burns were severe. Without treatment, infection was setting in. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to find himself muttering about the light, the flash, the impossible destruction. The other passengers on the train stared at the three burned men from Hiroshima, fear and pity in their eyes. Now, before we continue, take a moment to reflect on what you have witnessed so far. Consider this second lesson from Tsutomu's journey. In our darkest moments, what keeps us alive is often not physical strength, but purpose. Tsutomu did not survive because he was superhuman. He survived because he had a reason to survive. His family was waiting. When catastrophe strikes, when pain seems unbearable, when giving up would be easier, then going on, what will be your reason to keep moving forward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What gives your life purpose? What would keep you fighting when everything seems lost? Chapter 3, The Impossible Journey Home. The train rattled through the Japanese countryside, carrying Tsutomu Yamaguchi away from one nightmare and unknowingly toward another. Outside the windows, the landscape of late summer rolled by. Rice paddies green and ready for harvest, mountains shrouded in mist, small villages that seemed impossibly peaceful compared to what he had just witnessed. But Tsutomu saw none of it. His body was fighting a battle it did not understand, trying to cope with radiation exposure that would not be fully understood for years to come. The burns on his face and arm throbbed with each heartbeat. His skin had begun to blister, fluid seeping through the damaged tissue. The pain was constant, all-consuming, but worse was the fever that gripped him. His body temperature spiked and fell unpredictably. One moment he shivered uncontrollably. The next he felt as if he were burning from the inside. This was radiation poisoning beginning its insidious work, attacking his cells at the molecular level, damaging his bone marrow, disrupting his body's ability to heal itself. The train journey that normally took several hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Tsutomu drifted in and out of consciousness. In his more lucid moments, he tried to make sense of what had happened. As an engineer, he understood explosives, understood the mathematics of force and energy. But what he had witnessed defied everything he knew. A single bomb that could destroy an entire city. The blast radius had been kilometers wide. The heat intense enough to vaporize concrete and steel. How is such a thing possible? His two colleagues, suffering their own injuries and trauma, tried to help him as best they could. They shared water, though their canteens were nearly empty. They used torn pieces of their clothing to wrap his worst burns. Makeshift bandages that did little but kept the wounds from being exposed to air. The other passengers on the train kept their distance, frightened by the severity of the injuries, perhaps sensing that something unprecedented had occurred. When the train finally pulled into Nagasaki Station on the evening of August 6th, Tsutomu could barely stand. His colleagues helped him off the train, supporting his weight between them. The station was crowded with people going about their normal business, utterly unaware of what had befallen Hiroshima. To them, this was just another day in wartime Japan. Difficult, yes, but normal. Tsutomu's home was in the Urakami Valley district of Nagasaki, north of the city center. With each step toward home, he drew on reserves of strength he did not know he possessed. His legs trembled, his vision blurred, but he kept moving because Hisako and the children were waiting. Because he had to. Make it home, because surrendering to his injuries here, so close to safety, was unthinkable. When he finally reached his house, night had fallen. The traditional wooden structure sat among similar homes on a hillside, simple but sturdy, a place where laughter and love had lived. Tsutomu stood at the entrance, swaying on his feet, and called out for his wife. The door slid open and Hisako appeared. Her face, illuminated by lamplight, showed confusion that rapidly transformed into horror as she saw her husband's condition. His left side was a mass of blisters and burned tissue. His face was swollen and discolored. His clothes were torn and stained with blood and ash. He looked less like a man and more like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. Hisako's scream brought the children running. They stopped at the sight of their father, unable to recognize this wounded stranger. Tsutomu tried to smile, tried to reassure them that everything would be all right, but his blistered lips could barely form words. He collapsed in the doorway, his strength finally exhausted. What followed was a long night of frantic care. Hisako, though terrified and overwhelmed, cleaned his wounds as best she could with the limited medical supplies available. There was no hospital to take him to. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with routine wartime injuries and had no capacity for cases like this. Besides, how could you treat injuries that no doctor had ever seen before? Tsutomu lay on a futon in his home, burning with fever, his body racked with pain. He tried to tell Hisako what had happened, but the story sounded insane even to his own ears. A single bomb that destroyed an entire city. A flash of light brighter than the sun. He could see in her eyes that she did not fully believe him, that she thought the trauma had disturbed his mind. How could anyone believe such a thing without witnessing it? That night, as Tsutomu drifted in and out of consciousness, he heard Hisako praying to ancestors and gods for his survival. He felt the cool cloth she placed on his forehead, heard her gentle voice urging him to stay alive, to keep fighting. These small acts of love, these tender mercies, were what tethered him to life when his body wanted to surrender. The next day, August 7th, brought no improvement. Tsutomu's burns had begun to suppurate, oozing plasma and blood. The pain, if anything, had intensified as nerve endings that had been shocked into silence began to scream again. He could not eat. Water made him nauseous. His body was rejecting everything, shutting down system by system. August 8th passed in a similar fog. Hisako changed his bandages, whispering encouragement, pretending a confidence she did not feel. The children were kept away, shielded from seeing their father in such a state. Neighbors came by, having heard about the man who had returned from Hiroshima with terrible injuries. They brought what little food they could spare, offered prayers, spoke in hushed tones about the rumors filtering in about what had happened to that city. By the evening of August 8th, Tsutomu knew he could not hide at home any longer. He was a Mitsubishi employee, a valuable engineer. He had a duty to report what he had seen, to inform his superiors about this new weapon that had been unleashed. Despite Hisako's protests, despite his body's desperate need for rest, Tsutomu made a decision that would seal his place in history. He would go to work the next morning. He would tell them what happened. He would warn them. Here we find the third lesson from Tsutomu's extraordinary journey. Resilience is not about being unbreakable. It is about choosing to continue even when you are broken. Tsutomu could have stayed home, could have focused solely on his own survival and his family. No one would have blamed him. But even in his agony, even facing his own mortality, he felt a duty to warn others, to serve at Izat's purpose larger than himself. How many times in our own lives do we give up when faced with far less? How often do we let discomfort, let fear, let pain stop us from doing what we know is right? True strength is not the absence of weakness. It is acting despite our weaknesses. Think about the last time you pushed through something difficult. What kept you going? We would love to hear your stories in the comments. Thank you for staying with us through these difficult chapters. What you have witnessed so far is remarkable. But the most unbelievable part of Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story is yet to come. The worst is still ahead, but so is the most powerful demonstration of the human spirit you may ever hear. Chapter 4, 3 Days of False Security. August 9th, 1945 began like the previous 2 days, with pain. Tsutomu Yamaguchi woke in the pre-dawn darkness, his body stiff and aching, his burns still raw despite Hisako's devoted care. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his nervous system. His left arm, swollen and seeping, hung nearly useless at his side. The left side of his face felt tight and foreign, as if the skin belonged to someone else. Hisako begged him not to go. She knelt beside his futon, tears streaming down her face, pleading with him to stay home, to rest, to let his body heal. But Tsutomu was adamant. He was a Mitsubishi man. He had information that his company needed to hear. In his mind, shaped by Japanese culture's emphasis on duty and loyalty, not reporting to work would be a failure of character. With Hisako's reluctant help, he dressed. She wrapped fresh bandages around his arm and face, gentle as she could be, wincing at each indication of his pain. She helped him into a clean shirt, one that would not stick to his wounds. As he prepared to leave, their children watched from the doorway, confused by their father's condition, sensing their mother's fear but unable to fully comprehend what was happening. The walk to the Mitsubishi shipyard office took Tsutomu nearly an hour. Though normally it was a 20-minute journey, each step was an exercise in will over flesh. His body screamed at him to stop, to sit down, to surrender. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, down the hillside paths, through the streets of Nagasaki's Urakami Valley. Nagasaki that morning was beautiful. The sun rose over the harbor, gilding the water with gold. Merchant ships and military vessels sat at anchor. The massive Mitsubishi shipyard complex sprawled along the waterfront, its dry docks and assembly halls representing decades of industrial achievement. Beyond the shipyard, Nagasaki spread across its valley and up into the surrounding hills. A city of approximately 240,000 people, many of them workers and families connected to the Mitsubishi Corporation. The city had a unique character, shaped by its history as Japan's primary point of contact with the Western world during centuries of isolation. Portuguese and Dutch influences mingled with traditional Japanese architecture. Christian churches stood alongside Buddhist temples. Nagasaki had the largest Christian population in Japan, a legacy of missionaries who had arrived centuries before. The city felt cosmopolitan, worldly, in a way that other Japanese cities did not. When Tsutomu arrived at the Mitsubishi design office, his colleagues were shocked by his appearance. Word had not reached Nagasaki about the true extent of Hiroshima's destruction. There were rumors, yes, whispers about a terrible new weapon, but nothing concrete. The government was suppressing information, afraid of how the population would react. Tsutomu was ushered into the office of his department head, a stern older man who prided himself on rational thinking and dismissed most workers' complaints as exaggeration. Other engineers and administrators gathered around as Tsutomu, speaking with difficulty through his damaged mouth, began to tell his story. He described the flash of light, brighter than anything imaginable. He described the heat wave that had burned him from kilometers away. He told them about the pressure wave that had thrown him like a toy. He spoke about the destruction of Hiroshima, an entire city of 350,000 people essentially erased by a single bomb. He tried to convey the apocalyptic scenes he had witnessed, the dead and dying, the fires, the suffering beyond description. His superiors listened with growing skepticism. A single bomb, one bomb that could destroy an entire city? It was impossible. Tsutomu must have been confused, traumatized. Perhaps there had been a massive incendiary raid, hundreds of bombs, and in his shock, he had misremembered. Or perhaps this was a reaction to his injuries, his mind playing tricks on him. Yes, clearly he had been hurt, clearly Hiroshima had been attacked, but this story about one super weapon, this was delusional. Tsutomu grew frustrated, his voice rising as much as his damaged throat would allow. He was an engineer, a man of science and precision. He knew what he had seen. The mathematics of it were impossible according to conventional explosives, yes, but the evidence was undeniable. He had been there. He had survived it. Why would he lie? The argument continued, voices raised in the office, Tsutomu practically begging them to believe him, to take precautions, to somehow prepare for the possibility that such a weapon might be used again. His superiors remained unconvinced, their worldview unable to accommodate such a paradigm-shifting reality. It was approximately 11 in the morning when this debate was reaching its peak. Tsutomu stood near a window, his back to the city, gesticulating with his one good arm as he tried to make his case. His department head sat behind a desk, arms crossed, clearly losing patience with this hysterical employee. Other workers had gathered to witness this unusual scene. At 11:02 a.m., in the middle of Tsutomu's sentence, the room flooded with light. A flash, blinding, familiar, impossible. Time seemed to stop. Tsutomu's mind, which had been processing the memory of Hiroshima, suddenly snapped into the present moment with perfect clarity. He knew this light. He had seen it 3 days ago. His body reacted instantly, trained by trauma. He dropped to the floor, curling into a protective position, screaming for everyone to get down. The building's windows shattered inward. Glass became a weapon. Thousands of razor-sharp projectiles flying through the air at lethal velocity. Desks, papers, equipment, and people were thrown across the room by the pressure wave. The wooden building itself groaned and cracked, some walls collapsing, the structure twisting under forces it was never designed to withstand. For the second time in 3 days, Tsutomu Yamaguchi found himself at the center of nuclear devastation. When the initial shaking stopped, when the roar of the blast faded enough to think, Tsutomu raised his head, his ears were ringing again, blood trickling from his damaged left ear. The office was destroyed. His colleagues lay scattered like broken dolls, some moving, some ominously still. The department head who had doubted his story lay pinned under a collapsed beam, his face pale with shock and pain. Tsutomu struggled to his feet, his re-injured body protesting every movement. Through the shattered windows, he could see what had become of Nagasaki. The view was hideously familiar, a vast landscape of destruction. Buildings flattened or burning. A massive column of smoke and debris rising into the sky, mushrooming at its apex in that terrible, distinctive shape. It had happened again, against all probability, against all logic, against any conception of mercy or fate. Tsutomu Yamaguchi had been ground zero for a second atomic bomb. The bomb that struck Nagasaki, codenamed Fat Man, had actually missed its intended target by nearly 2 kilometers due to cloud cover and visibility issues. It detonated over the Urakami Valley, the industrial heart of Nagasaki, where the Mitsubishi factories and shipyards were concentrated. The bomb carried a plutonium core instead of uranium, was more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, but because of Nagasaki's hilly terrain, the destruction was somewhat more contained. Somewhat is a relative term when discussing nuclear weapons. Approximately 74,000 people would die, and the city's industrial capacity would be obliterated. Tsutomu's first coherent thought was not for himself. It was for Hisako and the children. His home was in this valley. His family had been there when the bomb fell. Were they alive? Were they buried under rubble? Were they burned, dying, calling for him? With single-minded determination born of absolute terror, Tsutomu began to make his way out of the damaged building. His body, already traumatized, now carried fresh injuries, burns on top of burns. His legs barely functioned. His lungs were filling with radioactive dust. But none of that mattered. He had to get home. The journey across the destroyed valley was worse than Hiroshima because this time it was personal. These were not strangers dying in the streets. These were his neighbors, his friends, people whose names he knew, children who had played with his own. The Christian cathedral that had been Nagasaki's pride, one of the largest in Asia, was a burning ruin. The Mitsubishi factories where thousands had worked that morning were twisted metal graveyards. Tsutomu climbed over debris, through fire, past the dead and dying, driven by a single thought: reach home, reach family, save them if they still lived, be with them if they did not. The lesson here is stark and painful. Life offers no guarantees of fairness. Tsutomu had already survived the impossible once. By any reasonable expectation, he should have been safe in Nagasaki. But the universe does not operate on our expectations of justice or fairness. Lightning can strike twice. Tragedy can find us again and again. The question is never, why me? Because there is no answer that will satisfy. The question is only, what now? How do we continue when everything we believed about probability and fairness has been shattered? How do we find the will to keep fighting when we have every reason to give up? Chapter 5. The Man Who Defied Two Bombs. The walk home through the destroyed Urakami Valley was a descent into a hell Tsutomu had already, at least states, experienced once before, but repetition did not make it easier. It made it worse. His mind, still processing the trauma from Hiroshima, now had to absorb this new reality. His own city, his own neighborhood, his own family caught in the same nuclear fire. Smoke obscured everything, turning midday into twilight. The air was thick with ash and the acrid smell of burning materials: wood, plastic, rubber, flesh. Tsutomu stumbled forward, calling out for Hisako, for his children, his voice hoarse and barely audible over the chaos around him. His burns, which had been slowly beginning to heal, had split open again from the violence of the second blast. Fresh blood mixed with plasma seeping from blistered skin. The landscape was surreal. Telephone poles leaned at impossible angles or lay across streets like fallen giants. Streetcar tracks had been torn from the ground and twisted into sculptural loops of metal. Buildings that had stood for generations were now nothing more than rubble and timber. Fires burned everywhere, small at first but growing as spilled fuel and broken gas lines fed the flames. Bodies lay in the streets, in doorways, scattered across what had been parks and playgrounds. Tsutomu forced himself not to look at their faces, terrified he would recognize someone he knew, more terrified still that he might recognize his own family among the dead. The survivors he passed were in various states of injury and shock. Some called out for help, but what could he do? He could barely walk himself, and his own family's fate was unknown. The roads Tsutomu had walked that morning were now unrecognizable. Landmarks that would have guided him home were gone. He navigated by memory and intuition, trying to reconstruct the path based on the position of hills and the few structures still standing. Each step was agony. His body was going into severe shock, his blood pressure dropping, his organs beginning to fail under the assault of radiation and trauma. When he finally reached the area where his house should have been, his heart nearly stopped. The entire block was destroyed. Wooden homes that had lined the hillside were now a jumbled mass of broken timber and roof tiles. Small fires burned in multiple locations, and somewhere in that devastation was his family. Tsutomu began to dig through the rubble of what he thought was his home, calling out Hisako's name, his children's names, listening desperately for any response. His hands, already burned and blistered, began to bleed as he tore at wooden beams and debris. Splinters drove deep into his flesh, but he did not notice, did not care. Then he heard it. A voice, weak, frightened, but unmistakably Hisako. She was alive. They were all alive. The story of their survival was itself miraculous. When the flash had come, Hisako had been inside the house with the children. The traditional Japanese construction, with its wooden frame and sliding paper doors, had essentially exploded around them. But the hill behind the house had provided some protection from the pressure wave, and a fallen beam had created a small pocket of space that prevented them from being crushed. They had been trapped for hours in darkness, unable to escape, not knowing if the world outside still existed. Tsutomu worked with manic energy. his body functioning on pure adrenaline, immune temporarily to its own damage. He shifted beams, cleared debris, widened the gap until finally, he could pull Hisako out. Then the children. They were injured, cuts, bruises, possible broken bones, but they were alive. The family stood together amid the ruins of their home, their neighborhood, their city, and the reality of their situation began to sink in. They had no house, no food, no clean water. Medical help was non-existent. The city's hospitals, those that had not been destroyed, were overwhelmed beyond any capacity to help. And all around them, Nagasaki burned. That night, the Yamaguchi family sheltered in, or what remained of their home, huddled together under a section of roof that had somehow stayed intact. Tsutomu lay with his family, his body finally giving out, fever raging through him, knowing he might not survive the night. His burns were infected. Radiation sickness was ravaging his system. He was bleeding internally. By any medical standard, he should have been dead already. But Hisako held him, whispered to him, refused to let him go. The children, though frightened and hurting, curled against their father, their presence a reminder of why he had to keep fighting. Even in the midst of nuclear apocalypse, love persisted. Even when everything else was destroyed, family remained. The days,